right. Good morning, everyone. Hope you had a great 4th of July weekend. Hope everybody was safe out there. Today we're going to go over scenarios that basically common and uncommon questions that prompt broker calls. So these are all actual questions that have come in over the past few months. And they're good teaching moments because I can show you actual parts of the contract that refer to the question, how it should be handled, things like that. So please, if you have any questions as we go along, you can throw them in chat, or if you want to raise your hand and ask a question live, I'll unmute you so you can ask a question. Or if you have a scenario that you want to get answered, you can throw it in the chat as well, or if you want to call me afterwards, always, that's fine too. For next week, I just want to let everybody know we are going to have a lone wolf trainer on, aka Zip Forms. So she's going to go over some really common questions. I know that Zip Forms has changed so much. They keep making these updates. I guess there's been some issues with the e-signature for some. I don't use that one, but yeah, we're going to have her on. She's going to go through Zip Forms training, different things you could do to make your life easier using Zip Forms. So yeah, please join in next Monday as well, because we're going to be going over that. So with that said, I say let's go ahead and get started here. So again, I'm just going to go over scenarios that come in. Sometimes regularly, sometimes it's kind of a one-off scenario, but what I'm going to do is let you know what the question was, and then I'll discuss, where in the contract or amendment or whatever it is, how it gets handled or what the contract says and how it should be handled. So this one came up basically just last week, and this one comes up here and there. I don't want to say regularly, but it does come up quite often. So seller sent us a counter offer, but then accepted another offer without notifying us before we responded. Can they do that? And the answer is yes. At any time during the offer or counter offer stage, seller can accept a competing offer without notice. We have to always keep in mind that time is of the essence of that. So basically, if a seller, you make an offer on a property, seller sends you a counter offer, and it expires in 3 days, that doesn't mean you have 3 days to respond. The seller can accept anything else at any other time, even 5 minutes after they send that to you. If they get a better offer in that they don't even want to counter offer, they can accept it right there. And you can see in 2B and C actually, it says if seller accepts another offer prior to buyer's acceptance, so that would be the seller counter offer shall be deemed revoked. So they're saying that this counter offer that they sent you would be revoked if they accept another competing offer. And then marketing to other buyers, sellers have the right to continue to offer the property for sale. Seller has the right to accept any offer, other offer received prior to acceptance of this counter offer by the buyer. Now they do advise in such an event, sellers advise to withdraw the seller counter offer before accepting the other offer, but they don't have to. They can just accept the other offer, and basically your counter offer is then revoked automatically. So this one comes up too. I mean, this is kind of common actually. The listing agent / seller let our offer expire and did not respond. What can I do? So now we're looking at the RPA. Paragraph 33 of the RPA states seller has no obligation to respond to an offer made. They have it in bold right there. It's 33A. So really, they have no obligation. I mean, they could just let the offer expire. There's no rule stating that they have to respond or they have to send you a decline or anything like that. They can just simply not respond. And that probably means that the offer was, not good enough for the seller to warrant a response. The expiration date time of offer counteroffer only relates to the amount of time the offer counteroffer is in effect. Again, um, just like kind of the counteroffer, it doesn't mean that they have X amount of days to respond to you. They don't have to respond. That's just how long that offer slash counteroffer is in effect. So if it's expired for 3 days, then the buyer is, bound to that offer for the next 3 days. Should the seller respond at any time with a acceptance or counter offer. So an example would be if a buyer makes an offer on property, seller does not respond prior to the expiration date. Then after the expiration date, the buyer would no longer be obligated to the terms of that offer and could offer on additional properties without concern. I know some of you out there are making offers on multiple properties, banking on the fact that we're probably going to get a counter offer, and it doesn't really matter. They're not going to be bound to each of the offers. I know that's kind of common, especially in a tight market. Even if the seller responded with an acceptance after the expiration date, the buyer would not be obligated to move forward. So they do need to respond before the expiration date if they want to keep it in play. But if they respond afterwards, technically the buyer is not bound to it, even if they accepted it straight up. Now, on a tangent, if you suspect that your offer was not presented, there are some things you can do. You want to document the date and time and method used to deliver the offer to the listing agent and any follow-up efforts on the status of the offer. Consider contacting the broker or the listing agent. Consider sending to the listing agent one of the car sample letters. Demand that offer be presented to seller. Request to participate in the presentation of offer, or request for listing broker's written confirmation that the offer was presented. So in zip forms, if you look through the libraries, most of them are defaulted to the car library, but there's a sample letters library in there as well that you can use for these types of demands and notices and things like that. There's lots of good ones in there, actually. Basically, you can copy paste it, or you can download it and send it over. Can you legally deliver the offer directly to the seller? So NAR Code of Ethics 1613 states that dealings with a seller who is subject to an exclusive agreement must be carried on with the seller's agent or broker, except with consent of the agent or when initiated by the seller. However, Model Rules 9.1 allows for direct negotiations if after reasonable effort and no less than 1 day, the buyer's broker cannot contact the listing broker, but the listing broker may preclude such direct negotiations by giving notice through the MLS. So if you want to check out Rule 9.1, you can read up more on that. So technically, yes, you can, but you need to make sure you're following the rule, pretty well. Next one up. Can a real estate licensee pay a referral fee or finder's fee to an unlicensed person? I actually get this question a lot. We've brought it up in previous webinars where we do these scenarios. So the answer is no, if the resulting transaction falls under RESPA. We've all, heard about RESPA, and maybe you're good at it or not good at it. There's some pretty good, kind of summaries for RESPA if you want to just kind of brush up on it. But yes, you can if it doesn't fall under RESPA. So a real estate agent may give someone a token of appreciation after receiving a referral. A real estate agent may give a commission rebate to his or her client. So commission rebates are fine. I get asked a lot of times, if I rebate X amount of commission to my buyer, Will I get 1099 for the full commission? No, you don't. You only get rebated for the commission that gets sent to you. And no, you do not need to 1099 your buyer because per the tax code, it is considered a rebate. So you don't need to send a 1099 for those. And they happen all the time, buyer rebates. I see them all the time. They're very common. So non-RESPA transactions, what is that? So that would be commercial property, that would be residential property with 5 or more units, agricultural property, vacant land, basically any property other than residential 1 to 4 unit property, a transaction not involving a federally regulated mortgage loan, such as a private one-time lender or an all-cash deal. So those would be the exceptions for paying a referral fee or finder's fee to an unlicensed person. California law allows a real estate agent to pay a referral fee to an unlicensed person for merely introducing a new client for these types of sales. And we're only talking about these non-RESPA ones. Everything else falls under RESPA, and you cannot do that. If, however, the unlicensed person goes beyond arranging an introduction, such as by negotiating the terms of a sale on behalf of a principal, a real estate agent may not compensate the unlicensed person for performing licensed acts. So they can make the introduction and then basically they need to go away. They can't be involved in the transaction or helping out. This comes up pretty regularly too. I get this question maybe once or twice a month. I just took a listing, but my seller doesn't want to put it on the market for another week. What do I do? So obviously we want to get our listing term in effect with our client, right? We want to get that contract active. So list per the MLS, listings need to be input into MLS no more than 24 hours after the beginning date in section 1 of the RLA. So we're looking at the RLA page 1 right now at the very top, section 1. We have the beginning and end date, and you have to have these both filled out. There needs to be a beginning and end date. Otherwise, your listing agreement is not valid. It's not enforceable. Your seller can cancel on it at any time. You have to have both of these dates. This date right here is when you want your agreement with the seller to become active. So you go on the listing appointment today and you're like, I want to get this listing. I want to get it locked up. You make it active for today. But by MLS rules, you would need to input it by tomorrow, right? But tomorrow may not be a good day to list. You know, I like to list on a Thursday or Friday usually. So what do you do? So if it's not a coming soon listing, needs to be into MLS on a later date, you will need to use the SELM form signed by the sellers, or simply just paragraph 71 filled out with the input date. So here is a snapshot of the listing agreement. Now we're on the top of page 3. So this is the bottom of page 2. This is the top of page 3 of the RLA itself, not the package. And you'll see right here, it says seller instructs broker to market the property to the public and to start marketing on the beginning date of this agreement, and then you just choose your date. So if it's supposed to go in this Friday, or next Friday, because you have to get photos and all this other stuff, just put that date right here and you're totally in compliance. So that's really all you need to do. You can use the SELM form. I mean, your local MLS may require that, but you can also just show them the listing agreement if there happens to be some sort of complaint risen or something like that about the start date, the actual start date. So let's see. We had a question come in. Can you use the DM LA form? What's the DMLA form? What's that one? Can you type that in the chat and I'll answer that? Now, if your listing is to be sold off market from MLS, you will need the SELM signed by the sellers or paragraph 7D2. So that is, again, same area, but now instead of 1, we're at 2. And, maybe it's a family sale, or, the seller already has a buyer for it or something like that. Maybe you're just doing the paperwork. You wanted to get the listing agreement in place just so you have your commission agreement in place. You would issue 7D2, seller instructs broker not to market the property to the public. This would also mean that you cannot put a sign in the yard too, and technically not posted on, social media and all this other stuff as well. That would be marketing to the public. So, yes, modification of the listing agreement. So back to the question. Disclosure modification of listing agreement, yes, you can use the modification of terms if you need to change that. Maybe you've already taken the listing and they're not ready to put it on the market and you didn't have that section filled out. You can use the modification of terms to go ahead and put that in place, that the on-market date is to be, some date in the future. Buyer is not making any repair requests. Do I still fill out the RR? So the request for repairs. I'm a fan of doing this. Do you have to? No, but it's good practice, in my opinion, to do this, and there's a couple reasons why. One is, I like to have everything documented about what the buyer is really, really wanting, and that it was explained to them that they could, do these certain things. And, we have a lot of verbal communication and stuff like that. And maybe, the buyer is just kind of letting you handle the transaction. But we do want a paper trail of those kinds of things, especially in that sense where they're like, oh, whatever you think is best. And you're like, well, I don't want to, I think we should just take it as is. There was multiple offers, yada, yada, yada. That can still get you in trouble because, something comes up post closing. Maybe they're going to rehab some of the home, all of the home, and there's things in there that ended up being worse than what they thought. Maybe they found a leak behind a wall or something like that that's been going on. That can come back on you because they can say, oh, well, I didn't even know I could ask for a credit, or, why didn't we try and get some extra money or something fixed? And you don't want that coming back on you. So, I mean, you can simply just put on here, buyer makes no request for repairs, credits, or price adjustments. The buyer's going to sign this form, even if the seller isn't going to sign it, because the listing agent may look at it, say, well, I'm not going to sign this. Why do I need to sign this? At least you'll have documentation that your buyer signed it in the file, and that you presented it over to the listing agent. So you can simply just put that. The second reason, so this will create a more formal paper trail with the buyer that they did not want to make any requests. And additionally, there's a release on this. And if you haven't really looked at the request for repairs form, in section 4B, it says buyer releases seller from any loss, liability, expense, claim, or cause of action regarding the disclosed condition of the property. And you can use that, if the seller, listing agent's like, I don't want to sign this, why are you sending this to me? I mean, this is something that I would want my seller to sign off on too, and that the buyer is agreeing that they're releasing me from any loss, liability, things like that. Now, does that prevent a lawsuit? Not necessarily. Does it give you ammo in the lawsuit? It does, because the buyer is saying, yeah, I agree with not, asking for any repairs or credits. I'm good with the condition of the house is what I'm saying. I'm going to release my contingency, and I'm also releasing you of loss, liability, expense, claim, or cause of action. So I think it's good to do this. Is it a requirement? It's not, but in my opinion, it's good risk management. So my buyer made a request for repairs, but the seller is not responding. What do I do? Also very common. It's good practice for the listing agent to have the seller formally reject any request for repairs that they are not willing to entertain. So if you're on the listing side, I would encourage your seller to just decline. Um, However, just as the seller is not legally required to respond to an offer, a seller also has no requirement to respond to a request for repairs or an amendment. Again, that's why it's called a request for repairs. You're asking the seller to amend the original agreement that you have in place right now. That's what this is. So there's no obligation of the seller whatsoever. So it's 14B2 of the RPA. Buyer may, within the time specified, paragraph 3L3, request that the seller make repairs or take any other action regarding the property. You'll see seller has no obligation to agree or to respond to buyer's requests. If seller does not agree or does not respond, buyer is not contractually entitled to have repairs or other requests made and may only cancel based on contingencies in this agreement. So again, the seller has no obligation, responsibility, anything to respond to these requests for repairs. However, what do you do from there? So let's say they're not responding. That doesn't mean that just because you sent the request for repairs, the day of performance for contingencies to be released, that contingency timeline just keeps it getting extended until they respond. That's not what happens whatsoever. The buyer still is obligated to perform on the original contract terms. So they're required to perform on the contract regarding timelines to remove contingencies, and the seller may choose to send a notice to perform. That might be their response is, hey, it's time for you to remove contingencies. That might, it's not the response you were looking for, but that is, what they can do. Should the buyer not remove the applicable contingency, seller may cancel per the terms of the notice to perform. So, even though they're not responding, buyer still has to keep performing. They're going to be obligated to either take the property as it is because the seller is not responding, or cancel if they think that, the property is, in a condition that is not acceptable to them. Let's see, we have a question. If a listing agent receives removal for all contingencies, can buyers still send in a RR afterwards? I guess you can, but I think the leverage is not quite there because, um, you know, you've already released the contingencies at that point. So where's the motivation from the seller? Because if the buyer doesn't continue to move forward and close this deal, they would be in breach and their earnest money would be in jeopardy at that point. So can they? As far as I know, yes, they can. I mean, you can send anything at any time. Doesn't need to be responded to, though. What if a seller asked to waive contingency and buyer did, but they did also sign the RR afterwards? So I'm going to get into that next, actually. So the request for repairs does not extend investigation timelines. I just went over that. Buyer must choose to exercise the right to cancel based on adverse findings from investigations or proceed with the purchase of the home and release their investigation contingencies. And I'll cover that other question just a few more down here. This one came up a little while ago. Counting days is really important when trying to figure out what the day of performance is. So seller has an SIP, that is a seller in possession, in place. When does the timeline start? You'll see here in the counting days section in the RPA, it says close of escrow, number 6 here, is considered day 0 for purposes of counting days. Seller is allowed to remain in possession if permitted by this agreement. So, you close on Friday, that's day 0. Saturday would be day 1. Sunday, day 2, Monday, day 3. So that's how you count the days. Just close of escrow is day 0, not day 1. The close of escrow date has passed, and now the buyer wants to cancel. Can we keep their earnest money deposit? So when I get this question, my first question back to the agent asking this question is always, are all of the contingencies released? If they are released, then yes, the seller could be entitled to the earnest money. If there are contingencies in place still, the buyer may have a legal way to cancel, even if they are past the close of escrow date. So if you are a listing agent and you are not, I guess forcing the buyer to remove contingencies along the way, you're leaving them an out this whole time with contingencies. I mean, you can be past close of escrow, and if all of the buyer's contingencies are in place, they can cancel based on an investigation or just about anything at that point and leave the transaction and retain their earnest money. I mean, it'd be very, very hard to dispute that because their contingency is in place. And the seller is going to be super mad about that too. So you have to remember, as a listing agent, your responsibility and your duty to your client as a listing agent is to make sure the buyer is performing on all aspects of the contract. Don't be shy to send notices to perform. It's just business. All you're doing is representing your owner properly by forcing the buyer to perform on the contract, and or leaving your seller, your owner, in a leveraged position to be able to cancel and not be drug out of, in time here. So contingencies must be physically removed no sooner than the date of performance in the contract. Always use a contingency release form. Just because the date has passed on the contingency doesn't mean that it's no longer in effect. It remains in effect until you have removed it physically by using Form CR. Chip away contingency releases throughout the escrow period according to contract timelines. Use notice to perform when necessary. If buyers are refusing to release contingencies per the timelines and the seller has fully performed, that is always the key. Have they fully performed? Have they provided every single seller document there is, including the listing agent's avid? That is also included. You have to make sure that everything has been provided to them. NHDs, avids, all the seller disclosures, and they've done everything in the contract. That is fully performing on the seller side. Then you want to deliver these notice to performs to maintain leverage, because if the seller has not performed and they deliver a notice to perform, the buyer can rebuke that. So if a buyer needs an extension of time, my personal policy is get something in exchange. So sure, you want more time, what are you going to give me? I'm a fan of either partial or full earnest money release to the seller, or a per diem charge agreed to. You can even do both. I'm not always a fan of the per diem charge. I prefer the EMD release. This way, if the buyer ends up defaulting or canceling later in the escrow period, the EMD has already been released and there's there's little or no monetary dispute to resolve. So, they're running late, and finally you get the earnest money released to you in exchange for another week or maybe 2 weeks of escrow time, and then they still don't close. The lender's giving you the runaround, whatever the story is. I mean, the seller can send a demand to close, doesn't happen, they can cancel the transaction. They've already retained the earnest money at that point, and they just move on, and the seller is out. I mean, the buyer is out the earnest money, and that's, an unfortunate thing, but you gave them extra time in exchange. I mean, this is a business contract here. So that's how I handle it usually. And if the buyer is unwilling to release the earnest money or pay a per diem, I have to have that conversation with my seller. Look, they could keep dragging this out. You need to sell this. You need to move on. We can either send demand to close now and cancel and move on to the next buyer, or if you want to let them keep stringing us along, we can do that. I always do let it be in the hands of the seller, but I advise them on what, can be done to maintain a leverage position the whole time. One reason why I'm not super fond of the per diem charge is if the buyer is already tight on funds to close, the per diem charge can sometimes cause a bigger issue at closing. So that's why I prefer the EMD release. Maybe you have an FHA or a VA buyer, they don't have a lot of funds, using up their whole savings just to buy this house, and they're running a week late and you're charging them $100 a day per diem as a late fee. And now it's been a week, now they got another $700 adding on to their closing costs. I mean, that can make or sometimes it's that tight. I've seen it make or break a deal sometimes. So that's why I'm not a huge fan of that. But it does put pressure on everybody. So long as it actually closes. I mean, if they have their earnest money, I mean, their contingency is released. I mean, it's still in place. They can cancel, and then you're not getting any per diem, and now you just waited an extra week. So that's why I'm not a huge fan of that. A couple questions came up. Do you ask for proof if the loan contingency, if it is the only thing that's left on the contingency? I'm not sure what you mean by that one. Client waived inspection but didn't waive the loan. After 5 days, they didn't like the inspection. Can we back out and just say the loan didn't go through? Oh, do they need to ask proof of that? If I was a listing agent and you did that to me, I'm gonna want something from the lender stating that the loan was denied for sure. I'm not gonna let them just get away with that. And if the lender is gonna produce some false document stating that the loan was denied, then, that can be a problem for the lender themselves. That's an ethical issue. But yeah, you have to be careful when you are going non-contingent offers, and I'm gonna touch on that a little bit later as well. So FHA, the appraiser conditioned for repairs on an FHA appraisal. Who pays for these repairs? What happens if the seller refuses to make repairs? So paragraph 5C4 of the RPA pertains to FHA VA offers, if you want to read about it. So if FHA or VA is checked in paragraph 3E of the grid, so this is first page right here, you would be checking that it's an FHA or VA offer. Let's see where I go. The FVAC shall be incorporated and signed by all parties. Buyer shall, within this time specified in paragraph 3E1, deliver to seller written notice of any lender requirements that the buyer requests the seller to pay for or otherwise correct, or that there are no lender requirements. So you do have to notify them that there are no lender requirements as well. Notwithstanding seller's agreement that the buyer may obtain FHA or VA financing, seller has no obligation to pay or satisfy any or all of the lender requirements unless agreed to in writing. So the seller, if you write this offer just the way it looks right now, you put in there that they're, making this offer, this is their loan amount, they're using FHA financing, they sign the FVAC, the appraiser goes out there and conditions for, painting of the eaves, fixing the fence, fix the wobbly toilet, whatever. That doesn't mean the seller has agreed up front to fix those items. They're only agreeing that the buyer can use FHA financing to purchase this house. So the seller may decline, especially if there is a lot of items and it's a hefty bill or something like that, or maybe it wasn't explained to the seller properly that, the buyer can only obtain this house using FHA financing, and if there are repair requests, they're going to have to be addressed. Otherwise, the loan isn't going to fund. You want to make sure you're explaining this to your seller. So you can also see from this paragraph that the seller has no obligation to pay for or correct any lender appraisal requirements for the home to qualify for FHA VA. They are merely agreeing the buyer can use it. That's right here. If you have a concern that the seller may not agree to correct lender appraisal requirements, then this should be addressed in the original offer and counter offer. This will bind the seller to make these corrections if required, and you can use section G2 of the grid section of the RPA to do this. Put in additional finance terms if you want, something like seller to correct. At the seller's expense, you need to specify who's going to pay any lender or appraisal requirements within 5 days of being notified of the requirement from the buyer. So that way the seller is agreeing upfront that they are going to repair or correct any items called out by the appraiser. So this will, in a sense, make it a little more bulletproof as you're going through the transaction, that it's already been agreed to that the seller is going to pay or correct these. Home did not appraise and the buyer is canceling. The listing agent asked for a copy of the appraisal. Do I have to provide it? And the answer is yes. If the buyer is exercising their right to cancel based on the appraisal contingency, they must provide a copy of the appraisal upon request. This is paragraph 8B1 of the RPA. We're talking about the appraisal. And it says right here, buyer shall deliver a copy of the written appraisal to seller upon request. And this is for any cancellation based upon the appraisal contingency. So if you're using the appraisal contingency to cancel, then yes, you have to provide a copy to the seller. That's pre-printed in the RPA. This is a fun one. Home did not appraise and we waived the appraisal contingency up front. Can the buyer use the loan contingency to cancel since they won't have enough money to close escrow now? Section 8B2 of the RPA covers this scenario, and the answer is no. But buyers wanting to waive the appraisal up front with thoughts that they can use the loan contingency to cancel, refer them to this section of the RPA. Clearly states no appraisal contingency. If no appraisal contingency is checked in the grid section there, then buyer may not use the loan contingency specified in the grid section to cancel this agreement if the sole reason is for not obtaining the loan is that the appraisal relied upon by the buyer's lender values the property at an amount less than specified in the grid. If buyer is unable to obtain the loan specified solely for this reason, seller may be entitled to buyer's deposit or other legal remedies. So you cannot use the loan contingency to cancel if you are waiving the appraisal contingency up front. And the same thing goes for the investigations contingency. And I know this is kind of a sneaky one that agents try and use quite often. Got another question here before I move on. If a buyer agrees, or if an FHA buyer agrees to pay for any repairs to get an accepted offer, can they still back out of it if it becomes a hefty bill? So if FHA buyer agrees to pay for any repairs to get accepted, can they still back out of it? Well, I guess the answer would be yes if they have their contingency in place. They're agreeing to pay for the repairs, but if they don't like what the repairs are, they can still move on. So you have to have that the investigations contingency still in place in order to do that, though. So just keep that in mind. So we waived our appraisal contingency, but not our investigations contingency. Can we use investigations contingency to cancel if the home is not appraised? And again, I know this is kind of a sneaky tactic. I advise against this tactic as the EMD can be disputed by the listing agent / seller pretty easily, actually. Especially if you're dealing with, a pretty experienced listing agent. I would sniff that out pretty quick. The reason is due to paragraph 14 of the RPA. It clearly and boldly states that a cancellation based on contingencies must be exercised in good faith. So when you guys call me, or a client is asking me questions about canceling for any reason whatsoever, I mean, it's kind of a yes, it's kind of a no. It must be exercised in good faith. So that's where a dispute can come into play. And that's where earnest money can get tied up in escrow, because it takes two parties buyer and seller to release the earnest money to agree upon it. So just because you cancel doesn't mean that the earnest money is getting released. And just because you cancel with a contingency in place doesn't mean the seller's still not going to dispute it. Now, they may be wrong, but we need their signature to release the earnest money back to the seller. Otherwise, we're going to mediation and all this other stuff, right? So you want to make sure it's very clear to your client that it must be done in good faith. So using the investigation contingency to cancel based on a low appraisal would not be canceling in good faith, and you may end up in an EMD dispute. Additionally, if you advised your buyer to do this and told them they can get their earnest money back because you will just use the investigations contingency to back out, could also land you in hot water with your client if they get caught up in an EMD dispute. I mean, that could legitimately happen. I've seen it happen. Contingencies are not interchangeable with, with one another. They are to be used for specific purposes during the escrow period, during the purchase. So here is that section 14, time periods, removal, contingencies, cancellation rights. It says any removal of contingencies or cancellation under this paragraph by either buyer or seller must be exercised in good faith and in writing. So this is where they're talking about, making sure you're doing it for the right reason. The buyer did not remove their contingencies after we provided them with a notice of buyer to perform. Can we cancel the sale and retain their earnest money? So per 14C of the RPA, the answer is most likely a no. I mean, there's small gray areas here and there, but 14C1 of the RPA clearly states that should the seller cancel the sale after first delivering the notice of buyer to perform, they shall authorize the return of the buyer's EMD. This also applies to contract obligations such as a buyer not providing updated lender contact, delivery of FHA, VA costs or terms, delivery of pre-approval letter. There's lots of contract obligations that aren't necessarily contingencies, they're contract obligations. But seller right to cancel for buyer contingencies, it says in such event, seller shall authorize the return of buyer's deposit except for fees incurred by the buyer. Same thing for contract obligations, exact same verbiage right here as well. So you send the notice to perform, buyer's still not performing, they're still not removing contingencies. Well, because the RPA has been agreed to already, then the seller has already agreed that should this event happen, this scenario happen where they have to cancel after sending a notice to perform based on contingencies or contract obligations, that they're agreeing to release the earnest money back to the seller, back to the buyer, less fees and costs. So buyer wants to make a non-contingent offer. Is this risky? Obviously, it's risky. I'm always going to advise against it. I know that you need to, be aggressive with some of these offers and remove contingencies and things like that. Let's go over what that looks like, though, and how you can still stay protected on both the buyer side and on the listing side. So the buyer may be at risk for losing their deposit or paying other damages if the buyer decides not to purchase after the offer is accepted because there may be no contractual rights to cancel the contract, even if the buyer decides to cancel before they deposit earnest money. And I am going to just tell a quick story on that. We had a buyer make a full non-contingent offer a few years back. And I told the agent, make sure they understand what this means, that their earnest money is, fully not non-refundable. They deposit their earnest money and they are purchasing this home regardless of any inspections or anything else. So again, this is a full non-contingent offer. We advise them, we send them disclosures, we tell them over and over and over again, I get it, yeah, no problem. They make the offer, it gets accepted. The very next day, they say, you know what, we don't want the house, we're going to cancel, and they have not deposited the earnest money. Well, the seller had nothing better to do, and they had lots of money, and it was a very large amount of earnest money. It was about $30,000, and they said, we're going to go ahead and get an attorney on this, and we're going to make you give us that 30K. And the seller pursued it, even though it didn't get deposited in the escrow. It was a contractual obligation. They made the agreement full non-contingent and then canceled. And so, yeah, don't do that. Make sure they understand what this really means. These contracts are for real. These are not games. I know a lot of buyers, maybe think that, oh, whatever, nothing will happen to me. I see people get sued a lot. So this risk needs to be carefully balanced against the risk of having an offer with contingencies rejected. Always use form NCOA for all waived contingencies, whether it's one or two or all of them. You have to include the NCOA and point it out to your client, make them read that. That's a non-contingent offer advisory. So does the buyer have any rights to cancel a contract written without any contingencies? Technically, yes, they do because of TDS law, or they technically can because of TDS law. So TDS law states that if the buyer's provided a real estate transfer disclosure statement, also known as the TDS, after the buyer submits the offer, or the TDS is updated or modified during the transaction, there is a statutory right to cancel the offer within 5 days after delivery of the TDS or updated TDS by deposit in mail or email, or 3 days after delivery in person. So count on it being 3 days. So you will get pushback on this if you are submitting an offer with investigations, contingencies waived, and it may cause your buyer's earnest money to remain unreleased in escrow in a dispute status. However, that is TDS law, and that is what your buyer would have to stand on. So what that looks like is seller has not provided any disclosures whatsoever, nothing in the MLS. They have not been provided to you. They accept your non-contingent offer, and then they provide you the seller disclosure package. That would be the only out for your buyer if they have investigations, contingency released, or maybe all of them released, and the TDS has some adverse things on it. They can cancel still based on TDS law, but it's going to be sticky. More than likely the listing agent's going to be upset. The seller's not going to understand. Earnest money's probably going to get tied up in escrow. And again, any contingencies waived, use form NCOA. So what should a seller know before accepting a non-contingent offer? And what should you do as a listing agent to make sure you don't get caught up in this? Because is the offer truly non-contingent based on if you provided the disclosures or not? So if the offer is written as all cash with no loan contingencies, the seller should verify the buyer has sufficient funds for a down payment or entire purchase before accepting the offer. If the offer is written without an appraisal contingency in a rapidly rising market, or even one with increasing inventory and market times, which we're kind of seeing right now, and we might start seeing some appraisers not be so generous with values. The property may not appraise, and the buyer, even if in breach, may be willing to cancel and risk a dispute with the seller. So you're going to have to explain that to your sellers as well. There's no guarantee a lender will loan, but a fully underwritten, pre-approved buyer is about as close as you can get to knowing that the loan is going to be good. So if they're waiving that loan contingency, question the lender. You have a right as a listing agent to call that lender, get an update, ask about status, ask about the qualifications of the buyer. And a buyer may have a statutory right to cancel and be entitled to earnest money, return of earnest money deposit if the seller provides the buyer with a TDS after the buyer submits the offer. If the market practice is to deliver the TDS after the offer is received, there may be little risk and even benefit in allowing the buyer an inspection contingency for the same time period that the statutory cancellation right is in effect. So if you are like, great, they're waiving it, you want to provide all of your disclosures to the buyer before accepting their offer to make sure they have absolutely no right to cancel based on TDS law. So, because if you provide it afterwards and you have a savvy agent on the other side who knows this, they can cancel and they could be within their legal right to do so based on that law. So keep that a note as a listing agent. You're receiving non-contingent offers. Get your disclosures out before you accept, and yeah, move on from there. Remember, 5 days after TDS delivery by deposit mail, or 3 days after delivery in person. Deposits are not automatically released to a seller, even if the buyer does not perform. A dispute over return of earnest money may keep the seller's property off market until that dispute is resolved through mediation or court. Buyers who feel powerless in the purchase process may be more likely to become disgruntled after the sale, which could increase the possibility of a legal claim. Even if the buyer's claim is contractually baseless, the seller would still have to incur time and cost to defend against any such claim. I'll provide this document, as I always do, in the recording in the Facebook group. That way there you can click this link for a guide on non-contingent offers. We just went over, if you're a listing agent, what to do. I think we have 1 or 2 more, probably in right about 10. So my buyer won't remove contingencies prior to the seller making the repairs because they think they will be giving up a cancellation right if the seller fails to make the repairs. Once the seller agrees in writing to make repairs, paragraph 15 of the RPA requires the seller to complete the repairs prior to the final verification of condition, which is 5 days prior to close of escrow by default, pursuant to paragraph 3J. So the buyer can do they can perform a verification of property condition 5 days, or up to 5 days before closing. The seller has up to that timeline to make the repairs and get them completed. Now, if we're dealing with an FHA loan, that gets a little tight. That's why I recommended, that little paragraph to be added, that they complete them, 5 days after receiving notice, so that the appraiser can go back out and re-inspect. So, keep that in mind on what you're dealing with, what type of loan on the other side, so you don't run into late closings and things like that. It also requires, among other things, that the repairs will be made in good and skillful manner and comply with applicable law, including governmental permit, inspection, and approval if required. So does not state that it has to be performed by a licensed contractor. If you are wanting to put that stipulation in, and you're going to be asking for repairs, you want to put that either in your original RPA or in your request for repairs that they are performed by a licensed contractor. This is an obligation of the contract and is not waived by the buyer's removal of contingencies. At the final verification, also known as the walkthrough, the buyer has a right to verify that repairs have been completed as agreed. If not, such failure may possibly constitute a material breach of contract by the seller. At that point, the buyer needs to determine if they are going to proceed with the close and then seek remedy afterwards, aka small claims court, or what they want to do. But paragraph 16 here goes over the verification of condition. Paragraph 4A of the request for repairs also states that if there is an agreement on repairs, the buyer agrees to remove the investigation of property contingency. So one makes the other go into effect. So if the buyer does not remove the contingency, then technically that agreement is not fulfilled for the seller to be obligated to make those repairs. If the buyer does not remove the contingency, the seller may send a notice to perform and cancel on the buyer, even though they came to an agreement on repairs. So this is paragraph 4 of the request for repairs. If seller agrees to all of buyer's requests or some of buyer's requests and buyer accepts seller's partial agreement below, 4A1, buyer removes the investigation of property contingency. That is by default. And then they can check, accept the following. So if you look at your CR form, your contingency release for, there's multiple things in there that you can release within the investigation's contingency. And maybe you're only going to remove a few things, or you can leave a few things in place, like maybe you haven't gotten HOA documents back or something like that, or maybe insurance isn't back yet, as far as can the property be insured at a reasonable rate for the buyer. So you would do accept maybe those items there, and then you're going to fill out the CR form with those exceptions, or only check the ones that you are releasing. So yeah, that's all I got for you today. That ran right about 10 o'clock. If you have any other scenarios, I usually jot these down, and then I do these once or twice a year. I think they're kind of fun. They're good learning experiences for everyone, because you can see actual questions that kind of come in, how they get answered. And then I like to point out the parts of the contract so that you can always reference those too, when you're dealing with a buyer or seller. So any questions? I'm always around. Call, text, email. I'm going to post this document in the comments section of the recording into the Rise Realty Facebook group. And feel free to comment on there. And if you have any other questions on it, you can also comment in there as well, and I'll answer those. So before we go, make sure we covered everything. I think so. Yep. So, all right. Hope it has a great week, and give me a call if you need anything. We'll talk to you later.